Israel's nightmare is not coming. It is already here. Most people still do not see it because they are waiting for one cinematic moment, one strike so large that nobody can deny the war has changed. That is not how systems break. Systems break when the assumptions holding them together stop working all at once. That is what is happening now. Israel's air and missile shield is no longer functioning the way its supporters promised. That is not a technical problem. It is the center of the entire war. A missile defense system is not just metal, radar, and interceptors. It is a psychological machine. It tells civilians they are safe. It tells investors the state is stable. It tells allies the war is manageable. It tells enemies the pain they impose will stay limited. Once that confidence starts to fail, the war changes shape. Now, every incoming missile means more than physical damage. It means the public has to confront a new possibility. The shield was never as absolute as they were told. That is why the nightmare is here. The second thing people still do not understand is that Iran no longer needs huge barrages to create huge political effects. If the missiles are accurate enough, if the payloads are heavy enough, and if the defenses on the other side are already strained enough, then 10 missiles can do the political work that once required 100. That changes everything. The war is no longer about volume alone. It is about accuracy, survivability, and psychological effect. It is about making the other side understand that the cost of every additional day is rising faster than the confidence needed to sustain the war. And the third thing people are still missing is even more dangerous. Large parts of the Iranian missile infrastructure in the east have not been meaningfully touched. Underground facilities remain, reserve capacity remains, depth remains. The war most people are watching on television is not the whole war. A large part of the Iranian system that matters most has survived. That means time is not automatically working for Israel and Washington. If anything, time is now working against them. Every additional day means more military cost, more economic cost, and more psychological cost. That is why the language in Washington is changing. At the beginning, the language was triumphalist, shock, resolve, pressure, decisive action. Now the language is about finding a way out. Now the language is about declaring victory and leaving. Now you hear behind the scenes and increasingly in public that there may be nothing meaningful left to win. That is not random. That is what people say when enough insiders have already understood that the fantasy of victory is dying. This war was launched in ignorance and arrogance. Ignorance because Washington and Tel Aviv did not understand Iran. Arrogance because they assumed enough force would produce enough fear, and enough fear would produce submission. But Iran is not a brittle client state. Iran is Persia, a civilizational state with memory, identity, strategic patience, and a political society that may be divided internally on many issues, but is not going to accept strategic humiliation from outside powers simply because those powers have superior air forces. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was even worse. The demands themselves were impossible. Give up enrichment, give up missiles, give up regional relationships, accept Israeli military and political supremacy in the region, accept American enforcement of that supremacy. In other words, surrender your sovereignty, surrender your deterrent, and then trust the people threatening you. No serious Iranian government could accept that and survive. So the war began from a false assumption. It began from the fantasy that enough military punishment could make Iran accept terms that no serious state would accept voluntarily. That is why the war is moving toward failure, not because the United States has suddenly become weak, but because force without a realistic political end state is simply a more expensive road to exhaustion. That is what this has become. Now add the economic layer, because this is where the whole conflict becomes larger than Israel and Iran. For decades, the American imperial system rested on simple bargain. Gulf oil would be sold in dollars. Those dollars would be recycled into American financial assets, especially treasuries. That constant global demand for dollars would help sustain the fiscal and military structure of American power. That is the petrodollar system. People talk about it as if it were an abstract financial concept. It is not. It is one of the hidden foundations of the entire imperial order. And what happens if Gulf energy infrastructure goes offline, even partially for months? What happens if shipping through the region becomes structurally insecure? What happens if the protector that promised to secure the energy system is exposed as unable to deliver? Then the question is no longer just whether fuel becomes expensive, but the deeper question becomes whether the whole credibility of the protection for recycling model starts to erode. That is the real danger. Now, the Gulf monarchies did not spend decades buying American protection because they enjoyed the symbolism of it. They bought protection because they believed it was real. They believed that when things became serious, the shield would hold and the routes would stay open. Now they are discovering something much uglier. The missiles still get through. The routes are not secure. The Houthis could not be subdued. Iran cannot be brought to heel, and the very region that was supposed to prove the durability of American power is now exposing its limits. Once the clients begin to doubt the protector, the system starts changing. And once the system changes, the consequences stop being regional. They become global. That is why the pressure inside Washington is changing at the beginning. It was all confidence. Now the whispers are about getting out that tells you exactly what insiders are seeing. They are finally understanding that this war may continue, but the chance of turning it into a meaningful victory is shrinking. This is where the Iranian strategy has to be understood correctly. Too many people still ask the wrong question. Can Iran defeat the United States conventionally? That was never the question. Iran never needed to defeat the United States in the conventional sense. Iran needed to do something much more realistic and much more dangerous. It needed to make American victory politically, economically, and psychologically unaffordable. That is the strategy. And if you look honestly at the war now, you can see that this strategy has been far sharper than most people in Washington wanted to admit. The missile campaign was never only about destruction. It was about exhausting defense stocks. It was about exposing the limits of the shield. It was about showing the Gulf states that the American guarantee was weaker than advertised. It was about showing Washington that escalation produces wider instability faster than political control. That is why deterrence has failed. Deterrence was supposed to stop this stage from ever arriving. It was supposed to reassure the Gulf. It was supposed to make Iran back down. Instead, the old deterrent story no longer maps onto reality. Then there's the munitions problem. Yes, the United States still has large stocks of ordinary munitions, but that is not the real issue. The issue is the expensive, specialized systems, the advanced interceptors, the missile defense architecture required to keep a technologically superior military and its allies alive against a serious missile power. Those stocks are not infinite, and the industrial base behind them is not built for a long war of this type. That is another uncomfortable truth. America has organized itself for short wars of punishment. It has not organized itself for prolonged industrial missile wars against resilient regional powers. Iran understands this. Russia understands this. China certainly understands this. And that is why the production question matters so much. The side that can regenerate enough pain faster than the other side can regenerate enough protection gains an advantage over time, even if it began weaker. That is how long wars are decided: by endurance, by production, by patience, by political will. This is why the comparison to the Houthis matters. If Washington could not suppress a much weaker actor in Yemen, why did it assume it could compel a civilizational state of more than 90 million people to surrender? That was never serious analysis. That was fantasy. And fantasy survives the first week of war much better than the second month. Now let us talk about regime change, because that fantasy is still floating around too. This war has actually made regime change less likely in the near term, not more likely. Bombing creates nationalism. It forces cohesion. It turns internal criticism into collective resistance. That is exactly what has happened here. Whatever differences existed inside Iran, the war compressed them into survival. So not only has regime change failed, the war itself made regime. That is another sign of strategic failure. And that is why any eventual settlement, if it comes, is likely to be humiliating for Washington. Not humiliating in a theatrical sense. Not because Iranian troops march into American territory. Humiliation for an empire looks different. It looks like descending from maximal demands to minimal exit terms. It looks like moving from "you must surrender everything" to "how do we stop this before it gets worse?" That is what humiliation looks like for a superpower. There is always one darker possibility. Israel has nuclear weapons. If Netanyahu reaches the point where conventional means no longer look sufficient and time no longer looks survivable, the temptation to consider taboo, breaking escalation rises. I do not say this lightly, and I do not say it because I think it happens tomorrow. I say it because once conventional options fail and political endings disappear, leaders begin staring at doors they once called unthinkable. If that door were open, the consequences would not be regional. They would be world historical. That is why this war now lives inside a much darker zone than most commentary is willing to admit. And this is also why Trump's problem is so severe. I believe Trump wants out. I think he now understands there is nothing meaningful left to win. But wanting out and being able to get out are not the same thing. How does he disengage when Israel is deteriorating? How does he disengage when Congress has been aligned for years with maximalist Israeli demands? How does he disengage after using language so absolute that any retreat now looks like weakness? That is the trap. He wants an off-ramp. But the political structure around him punishes realism. That is why I think the next phase will involve frantic private mediation. Someone somewhere will have to help Washington climb down. Not because America wants dignity, because America needs escape. And the terms of that escape are likely to be much smaller and much more humiliating than anyone in Washington wants to admit right now. So where does this go? Look at the structure. No realistic end state, no credible path to regime change, no clean ground option. Missile defenses degrading, munitions stress rising, energy shock deepening, petrodollar credibility weakening. Allied confidence fraying, domestic political will eroding. That is not the beginning of victory. That is the anatomy of imperial retreat. And that is why the real question now is not whether Israel can win. The real question is how much more pressure the system can absorb before the illusion finally breaks. Because once the illusion breaks, events move very fast. And if you want the whole story in one line, it is this. The nightmare is not that Israel and the United States were hit harder than expected. The nightmare is that they are finally discovering the war they chose cannot produce the future they demanded. And once a war reaches that point, the ending may still take time. But it is already written in the structure.